So today we're going to talk about these things, these bronze ritual vessels. And there are several in the collection here, and just about any museum you'll go to that has Chinese artifacts will have some of these. And in fact, there's probably more than 150,000 of these in existence in museums and private collections. And there may have been probably 10 times that many produced during the Shang Dynasty. And today I'm going to talk about how they were produced, the technology of production, but also the evolution of these designs, and then what these designs might mean. These were the most important artifacts in the Bronze Age of China. So we're talking the second millennium BC. The third millennium BC was, you could probably call it the Jade Age. Jade was the most important object for ritual, for power. But during the second millennium BC, it was bronze. Bronze was the way that the rulers expressed their power, and it's the way they communicated with their ancestors through ritual. And so that's what I'll be talking about today in a little overview. So we need to start with a slide I always bring up in my undergraduate classes. I call this my dragon of Chinese history. This is the chronology of the 24 different dynasties of Chinese history. So I want to lay out first what time period we're talking about. So we're really talking about the Shang Dynasty here, the yellow segment, and the Western Zhou. So we're looking at about 1500 BC to about 771 BC. So that's the time period we're looking at in the Bronze Age. Now, for those of you who know about Mesopotamia or Egypt, they'll say, well, that's kind of late for Bronze Age. The Bronze Age of Mesopotamia starts over 3000 BC. But bronze does not come to China until about 1800 BC or 1900 BC, so more than 1,000 years later than in the Near East. And that's always presented a difficulty. Is bronze technology an indigenous development in China, or was it imported or diffused from the West? So here we have a basic map of China, and I like to divide China into two river floodplains, basically two different civilizations, one in the north and one in the south. And later that will become very important when we talk about the kind of bronzes produced in the north versus the kind of bronzes produced down in the south. So the earliest bronze-using civilizations were up here on the Yellow River in the north. And yet the earliest bronzes ever found in China were here in the far northwest. And so this is suggestive that they diffused from the west, because we know that there were bronze-using cultures in Siberia at the time, and there were definitely some further to the west. So the earliest artifacts were found here in the northwest, suggesting that, yes, the technology did come in as a diffusion from the west. Now, we know a cluster of other technologies also came in from the west nearly at the same time, including chariots, horse-drawn chariots, and horse technology came in from Mongolia and from southern Russia at about the same time. Other things like writing, which develops at the same time as the bronze technology, may have been influenced or at least inspired by writing further to the west, which is much, much older. So here is one of these early bronzes found in northwest China. It's a bronze mirror, very similar to the kinds of mirrors you find in Central Asia and southern Russia. And this is the earliest, around 2000 BC. And it comes from the far northwest in what's now Gansu province. So the earliest ritual vessels made of bronze were found at a site called Arlito, right here, which is in what's now Henan province, near the Yellow River. See, here's the Yellow River going out to the sea here. And at this site, archaeologists found two palatial foundations, probably representing the palace of a king and an ancestral temple of the same kings. And at these palatial sites, they also buried their kings. And so in these burials, we find the first bronze-decorated cast artifacts. These very curious ones are bronze plaques, about this big, with a attachment points, probably for putting them onto fabric, and they were found on the chest of the deceased. So these were probably some sort of bronze emblems on the chest of these rulers. And you can see these animal face designs, which we'll be talking a lot about animal face designs today, in inlaid turquoise. But what really starts the tradition of bronze ritual vessels in China are these things. These are the earliest bronze vessels found in China. They date from between 1600 and 1800 BC from this Arleto site. And you can see that the decoration is very minimal. There's just some lines here. And this one is almost entirely undecorated. They're based on pottery prototypes. You can find pottery vessels at these sites that look very similar to these. So they're taking standard shapes of pottery vessels used for wine drinking, not fermented grapes, but it's fermented millet, so a fermented grain beverage. And this would be for food. This is a tripod for cooking food. These would be standard shapes in pottery, and so they're making these shapes in bronze for the first time to elevate them, because only the elite have access to bronze. So bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, and usually something else in China, lead, usually 20 to 30% lead. It helps it to flow better when you cast it. And bronze itself represents power, because to get this vessel, you need to have control over labor and resources and land. You need to have people that can mine this from the hills, who can smelt it. And then you need to have the power over resources to have a foundry that can cast something like this. So to have bronze meant you had power. And only the king had this power. He had the control. And so the king had a monopoly on bronze vessel production. If you did something nice for the king, like win a battle for him as a general, the king would allow you to use his bronze foundry and give you bronze. You could then make a vessel like this. So I want to talk about technology first, because there isn't just one way to make a bronze vessel. There's three different ways that were practiced in the ancient world to make a bronze vessel, but one way in particular became the Chinese way. And that way of making the vessel determined the design and the decoration of that vessel. So let's go to the West first and look at Greece for a while. So we look at how you make something vessel-shaped, like these Greek bronze helmets. These are hammered. They are put, you take a small disc of bronze on an anvil and you hammer it into this shape, like gradually bringing up the sides. Or something like this, Roman silver. This was also made by hammering. You start with a disc of silver and you hammer it up, and you use repoussé and other techniques to bring out the relief. So this is by hammering. So you start with, say, a small disc of bronze or copper, and you, by hammering at the inside or over a form, you gradually bring up the sides of the vessel. So this is the way that nearly every bronze vessel in Egypt or Mesopotamia or Greece would be made, through hammering. It usually leads to a very thin-walled vessel, and it suggests a scarcity or a rarity of the material, because you're trying to economize on it. It becomes very, very thin when you hammer it up like this. And it leads to certain types of decoration, certain styles of decoration, with things like the repoussé relief. Now, the second way to make a bronze vessel is with the lost wax casting technique. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of bronzes in Mesopotamia. This is from the Nahal Mishmal treasure, which is now in the Met. And this was cast using the lost wax technique. So using the lost wax casting technique, you can get organic shapes. You can cast almost anything that you can model in wax. It leads to a very soft, sort of rounded shapes because of the way you model the wax. Technologically, the way you make a lost wax casting is you start with a clay core, you wrap it with a bunch of wax, you then carve into the wax the detail you want, and then you have to add a bunch of vents and sprues and places where you can actually pour in. But then on top of that, once the wax is done, you add another layer of clay, which creates an envelope around the design. And then you heat it up, and all the wax pours out. Meanwhile, you've put spacers in between the clay and the outer clay so the thing doesn't collapse on itself. And so those are called chaplets here. So once you've poured out the wax, then you pour the bronze in, and the bronze, when you break off the outer mold, looks exactly like the wax that you had carved. And so that's how things like this were made, using the lost wax casting technique. This is also how nearly every Greek bronze statue was made, using this lost wax technique. But there is a third way to make a bronze vessel or a bronze statue, and that's the way the Chinese did it. And that's through the piece mold casting method. And here is a zoom in of one of the bronzes I look at today. And if you look at this decoration, it is very crisp. Extremely detailed, crisp, incised lines, which would be impossible with lost wax because of the nature of the wax material. So how was this made? Well, archaeologists, starting in the 20s, unearthed thousands of mold fragments from the site of the last Shang capital. And these showed us how they were made. They were made with molds that were modular. They were in different pieces, and I will take you through this technique. And the design was either carved in the mold itself, in the clay, or on a model, and then impressions were taken off that model. And this particular style of clay in North China, this loose soil, takes a very sharp edge and leads to this kind of very crisp decoration that isn't possible in wax. So here's, before I show you a video describing this, let me show you the process. So you start with a model. The model could be an actual bronze vessel. It could be a clay model that you carved, and it has most of the decoration on it. You then wrap it in clay, and then you cut off those sections of clay and pull them away. They then have a negative impression of the bronze. Then you take away the model from the inside and put in just a core, and then you reassemble the whole thing here upside down around that core. And then when you pour in the bronze, it then has the positive impression from the original model based on the negative impression from the mold. And then you break off this whole thing and you have your cast bronze. This is how all bronze vessels in ancient China were made. They are thick. They are heavy. Some of these things weigh more than 2,000 pounds. The biggest one ever made is 4,000 pounds, which weighs more than every bronze ever found in Greece or Mesopotamia combined in that one bronze. So bronze in China is extremely important, but it's not rare. The king has control over it, but this kind of method shows a plentitude of bronze. You can cast things if you've got a lot of it, because these are very thick-walled and very heavy, and for that reason, I say China chose this method, not just because bronze was more plentiful, but because of the importance of these vessels. That this showed the power of the king. The bigger the vessel, the more power. So let me show you a very quick movie clip, a modern recreation of how one of these was cast.
The techniques used for the production of bronzeware in Yin were outstanding. Their secret is thought to lie in the yellow earth, or loess, used in the molds. Metalworker Mitsuru Kashi has been working on reconstructing bronze artifacts from Yin using loess. When the loess is moistened and well kneaded, it becomes soft and fine clay. This clay is then pasted onto the original to replicate the pattern. This work requires patience, pasting the loess evenly into the finest of grooves, which are less than 1 millimeter in width. Will the loess succeed in accurately replicating the fine patterns on this bronze?
きれいに映ってますね。日本の土ですとね、多少こうに切れるんですよ。それが粘土分が多いもんですから、映ったものそのまんまがスッと抜けてくるんですね。ちぎれることないんですよね。
The pieces of patterned clay are joined together to make a mold. Dried loess is very hard and can withstand high temperatures. This earth, which softens when moist and hardens like stone when dry, was the most suitable material for bronze molds. After firing the mold for 8 hours in the kiln, the bronze is poured into the mold while still hot.
Hey, yo. せーの。
Molten bronze reaches a temperature of 1,100 degrees Celsius. The loess mold is able to withstand this heat. In order to remove the bronze, the mold has to be broken off. Only one piece of bronzeware can be made from each mold. It is easy to imagine just how valuable the bronzeware was to the people of Yin. The loess has perfectly transferred the complicated pattern onto the bronze. Newly made bronze objects had a golden luster. When the people saw the brilliance of the bronze, they must have felt renewed awe for the gods.
So you can imagine how incredibly expensive and important these items were, seeing the amount of labor that goes into just making and processing one of these. The king's tomb might have 500 of these in it. So you think of the level of the destruction of wealth that's going on to put these in a king's tomb. And I'll show you another tomb later, his wife's tomb, that had hundreds of these in it as well. And so the number of people, the man-hours to make one of these things shows that, yes, the investment of labor would probably be equivalent of a large pyramid in Egypt to produce this many bronzes for the royal family. So this was one of the main enterprises of the state, was to get the bronze and create these vessels. And I'll talk a little bit about how they were being used after I talk about the designs. So the bronzes are cast with these particular designs, and I'm going to go through the stylistic evolution of these designs by using Max Luhr's 4 styles, and I gave you some reading references for his first layout of this theory. So we begin with style 1. So he wanted to create a chronological and technological stylistic evolution of bronze vessel design because the vessels themselves are not dated. And there was no way to date them back before things like thermoluminescence or other dating techniques. So he wanted to date them based on their stylistic evolution. So the earliest one, Style 1, he looks at not just the decoration, but also the vessel shape. So the first criteria was that the vessel shape, the style of the vessel itself, is primitive. And by primitive, he means it's very close to the pottery prototypes. It hasn't diverged from a pottery shape or style. And it's a bit awkward and spindly. It hasn't shown a sort of artistic maturity. The decoration is always in some sort of horizontal frieze. Here we see the very beginnings of the sort of horizontal frieze which wraps around the vessel. And the relief is a very thread relief. It's a very thin relief, and you can see it here, and we saw it back here as well. And what this suggests is they're carving this relief in the mold, not on the model. So after they've taken off the impression from a undecorated model, they take some sort of incising tool, and they make a line pattern in the model. That will then lead to, in the mold, that will lead to a raised line on the final product. The earliest Style 1, here we have an interesting vessel. This is called a he, it's a wine pouring vessel. The earliest designs are these kind of swirls around a pair of eyes. So there's not much suggestion of a real animal here, or a real person, or a real deity, but we do see two eyes and some sort of swirls around it. This particular vessel is interesting because the prototype of this was not pottery originally, but sheet metal. Because it even has imitation rivets on the handle, and you can see a sort of folded join here. So it's a cast metal vessel imitating a sheet metal hammered vessel, which originally imitated a pottery vessel. So yeah, these are called skeuomorphs. It's a word for things that imitate something in another media. So this is a skeuomorph in bronze of a hammered bronze of a pottery prototype. Okay, Style 2. So when we get to Style 2, they start a coalescing of the design, and now the decoration has changed from being in the impressed mold to being on some sort of model. And you can tell that by the nature of these lines, with these very deep incised bands. This was cut onto some sort of clay model, and then the impressions were taken off. So we don't have that high thread relief that we had in Style 1. So this is characterized, we still get the two eyes, and thicker bands and swirls around the two eyes. But there's no differentiation between a foreground and a background. We don't know where this thing, whatever it is, begins and where it ends. There's no sort of division between foreground and background. And it's not really a real animal at this point. We don't have a hint of a fully developed mouth, and we can't really distinguish ears. We still see the eyes, but starting to coalesce at some hinting of a zoomorphic design. So here's another Style 2. You can see very clearly these thick bands. They were carved on the original model, not in the mold. So then we move to Style 3. So with Style 3, we get a very confident and developed artistic tradition. They started to increase the density of the design. So now we have the two eyes, but we have all these little vertical quills that are now starting to fill in the space, and these sort of curlicues which get denser and more developed. And an increase in sort of animal features. We get more suggestion of fangs or noses or ears on this creature here. But still, we can't really see it out of the background. It's still sort of in the middle of all these swirls. It's not sort of drawn out yet. here's another style 3. You can see big eyes, all these quills and curlicues, but still awash in this sea of curls. When we move to style 4, the artists have decided that the design is too complex, it's too hard to actually tell what they're doing, and they start to differentiate between the foreground and the background. And so you can see that they accomplish this with a difference in density. These little curlicue spirals called Leywen, or thunder patterns, have now been differentiated from the main animal mask design, which now has undecorated patches. So now the whole design, other than the eyes and this flange in the middle, is flush. So there's no difference in height between this section or this section. The difference in foreground and background has been achieved only by changing the density of the pattern. But now we can really start to see what looks like some sort of animal form here. We start to see horns and eyes, we see a mouth, we see legs and claws, and we see other smaller animal forms up here. And they're not realistic, they're sort of fantastic, and that's the next topic I'll talk about, is what are these things and what does it mean? Here we see another example of a style 4 tripod. And then we get to the final Shang style, which is style 5. So in style 5, the great innovation is relief. By style 5, you also get a further distancing from the original pottery prototypes. And you start to get vessels which are architectonic. They are more architectural. It looks more like a house. This is another wine vessel. You get more square vessels. Here you see a very good example of the modeling of the foreground here. But the shape does not exist in pottery prototypes. This is purely a metal shape, encouraged by the piece mold casting method, which encourages square shapes, obviously. So when Shang armies move into the south and to other places, they bring with them their bronze technology, and these southern chiefdoms and kingdoms in the south borrow Shang bronze casting technology, and they use it to create their own regional variants of Shang bronzes. And these regional variants are very wild. And you can definitely tell what a southern bronze looks like from a northern bronze because of the motifs. In the south, they like tigers, they like elephants, they like rams. And so here we have tigers here coming off the vessel, and we get these heads. These were done with the piece mold casting method, not by lost wax, by pre-making the head. This head would have been pre-cast earlier, and then you embed it in the mold for the next pour, leaving a little bit of a locking key exposed. And then when you pour the whole vessel, the bronze sort of envelops that locking key and then meshes with the head, which was pre-made. So these heads were pre-made and then embedded in the final mold, and then a second pour created the rest of the vessel. I like this one. This was in the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. This is another wine pouring vessel, but it's completely wild. You've got a bull on the back, you've got ram horns here, you've got a bird on the back with human legs, you've got a human here wrapped in a snake on the bottom, you've got a bird coming off the front. There's like 7 animals on this thing. Plus this big smiley monster mask at the front where your wine pours out. Yeah, so this one is completely wild. When I was in graduate school, one of my papers was figure out how this was made and how many different pours of metal. There were 12 pours of metal to make this thing because of all those pieces that stuck out on this. Here's a famous piece from the south as well. This is called a four-ram zun. There's 4 sheep on the outside this, and the legs go all the way down to the bottom. And these horns and the heads were also precast and put in the final mold for the vessel. After the Shang Dynasty was conquered by the Zhou Dynasty, the succeeding dynasty that happened in 1045, the Zhou also took over the bronze casting facilities of the Shang, and they made their own particular style of Shang bronzes, which was very distinct. It's very aggressive. There's lots of sharp, pointy things all over it. Horns coming here off the vessel, wrapping here, horns on the side. Very strong use of the flange on the edge to make these sort of hooked flanges. And so Zhou vessels are often distinguished by all their projecting points, many of which would have to be precast and then inserted into the later vessel. Function. So, how are these things used? Well, their primary purpose was in the ancestral worship cult. So the Chinese believed that their ancestors resided somewhere above, we could call it heaven, and that these ancestors had power. They had power to affect your fortunes in life, whether you got sick, how many children you had, whether your armies were victorious in battle. And the king's ancestors were very powerful. The highest of them even became deified. And so you had to feed these ancestors, and you fed them with wine and meat sacrifice, and what's now apparent is also human sacrifice. So you fed these ancestors with these vessels. And for that, you had an ancestral temple, where you had a collection of these vessels in the temple, and you went there on a regular basis, and you poured wine out for them, and you fed them with meat and grain, and you prayed for benefit. You prayed for them to help you to do something. And the inscriptions on them carry dedications to the father, to the grandfather, to the great-grandfather, and asked also that descendants would treasure this vessel for centuries. So these ancestors were powerful. They could help you, but they could also curse you. If you did not feed your ancestors, if you did not have sons who would then feed you, you cut off your family line, the ancestors could curse you and destroy your family. So the ancestors could also hurt you. But most people could not worship their ancestors with bronze vessels. Only the king could do that. But he could also convey this privilege on nobles and generals and other people so that they could also worship their ancestors with these powerful ritual devices. So they're found in 2 places. We find them in hoards, where there's maybe 100 of them buried all together somewhere. And then we find them in tombs. So obviously we're not going to find them in an ancestral temple because none of those survive. Everything above ground is destroyed. So the reason they're found in hoards is that when the Shang Dynasty fell, some people fled and had to bury them and run away, much like you find Roman silver hoards in Germany. When the Zhou Dynasty fell in 771 and they had to flee to the east, they also buried a bunch of their ritual vessels in hoards, thinking that they'd come back someday to get them, and they never did. And so archaeologists find them there. And then we find them in tombs. Let me talk about that in a little bit. This is a set that's in the net. It's called the Duanfang set. This may have been actually found together. So this sort of gives us an impression of what would an ancestral temple look like. You'd have an altar here, maybe of bronze, and you'd have these different vessels placed on the altar, and they all had a different purpose in a ritual. All of these are wine vessels. And so we know that the Shang were very much into this alcohol ritual, and that the ancestors were to drink this. It's possible that the Shang also got drunk, ecstatically drunk at these festivities. Later Zhou Dynasty vessels, wine vessels are much less prominent and eventually disappear entirely. The Zhou were convinced the Shang were drunkards, and that they lost the mandate of heaven because they were drunk all the time. So the Zhou made it illegal to drink anywhere outside the ancestral temple because they thought the Shang lost the mandate of heaven because they were drinking all the time. And based on the number of vessels, possibly so. So this is a tomb where they were found 330 bronze vessels. This is the tomb of the Queen Fu Hao. It's the only unplundered Shang tomb ever found. In 1975, she was the wife of King Wu Ding. His tomb was plundered shortly after his burial. Hers was sort of like the King Tut's tomb. It was found unplundered, full of 330 bronzes, hundreds of jades. She also was buried with 5 human sacrifices. But half of the bronzes in the tomb, more than 100 of them, have her posthumous name, Hou Wu Xin, which gives the day that she would receive sacrifice from her sons. This vessel weighs about 500 pounds. This is a big one. So, if it's her posthumous name, that means these were made between when she died and when she was buried. And normally in Chinese funeral ritual, that's less than 3 months. So in less than 3 months, they cast 100 bronzes of this size and buried them in her tomb because of the way we see her name. So it's believed then that what she's doing in the tomb is she's sacrificing to her ancestors while she's a spirit. So she has these vessels in her tomb, not just to show how rich and powerful she was, which she was. She had her own walled city, she commanded an army of 5,000 troops, but she was going to be making food for her ancestors while she's living in this tomb as a spirit. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about the designs themselves. This design, this animal mask design, has mystified people for centuries as, what does it mean? We want to find meaning in this design. It's on all these vessels, in all these variations. None of them look the same. Some of them have cow-like features, some have ram-like features, some have human-like features. They all look a little bit different, yet they have some things in common. And so I want to go through 3 leading theories as to what do these designs mean? What do they mean to the people of the Shang? So the first is a very text and art history driven thesis by a Japanese scholar named Hayashi Manao. And his thesis is that this design is nothing other than the highest deity of the Shang. And the highest deity was known as Shang Di, which means the high god. And so what he did is he went through the oracle bone inscriptions. These are the carved bones that the king used to divine questions from his ancestors. And he found the graph used to write the word Shangdi, or God above, the high God. And then he looked at rubbings of the design, which is often called a Taotie design. That's a much later term, not a Shang Dynasty term. And he made equivalences then between things like this triangular feature and the triangular nature of the center of the face, and these sort of stubby-looking arm things here, and these sort of wings that come off the side here. And so his analysis is that this is actually the highest god of the Shang, and they are putting him on their vessels. But what does this god do? So there's lots of gods. It's a polytheistic pantheon here. The god Di, or Shang Di, is the highest god in that he orders other gods to do things, or other nature powers to do things. So he sends the wind gods to create the wind. He sends the rain gods to create the rain. He sends the pestilence gods to send disease. And so he is the highest. And so by putting him on the vessel, you're not necessarily making sacrifices to him, because the sacrifices are to your ancestors. But by putting him on the side, you not only bring the potential that he will bring good luck and good fortune to you, but that he also might scare away any evil influences that might harm the ancestral sacrifice. So it's apotropaic in that way, that you're warding off evil. So that's one theory. The next theory was put forth by one of my teachers at Harvard, and this is Casey John's theory of shamanism. His thesis is that this is a helper spirit for a shaman to do a journey between this world and the spirit world. And so his reasoning goes like this. We know that shamans were incredibly common in later first millennium BC China. We see them in texts all the time. They communicated between this world and the spirit realm. And he also pointed out the fact that there were shamans in cultures of Siberia and throughout the New World, descended from those people from Siberia, people like the Maya, where it was incredibly important. And that in many of these shamanic cultures, some sort of ecstatic trance was induced in an individual, the shaman, and sometimes by substances like alcohol or mescaline or peyote or something else. And in this trance, they would journey to the other realm, where they would get wisdom and power and information from the ancestors or from other spirits. And in most Native American cultures and Siberian cultures, the shaman has helper spirits. They have helper animals who take them to the other world. And so he pointed out that in China we have images from before the Shang of what look like men riding animals. This is a carving from a jade from 2500 BC. And here is an example of a sort of Mayan shaman. The king here is looking for information, and he burns this special paper here covered in his own blood, and out of that rises a spirit of one of his ancestors, who then gives him information about the spirit world. Casey John also points to bronzes like this one from southern China, which shows a human being hugging a tiger, and he's about to put his head into the tiger's mouth. And in many of these shamanistic cultures, the portal to the other world is through the mouth of a creature. The Mayans as well. So you go into the spirit world by sort of going into the mouth of the beast. So he points to all these examples to say that the king, the Shang king, himself was a shaman. And in this ritual, he would drink a lot of wine and become ecstatic. And these animals, he thinks this is actually sort of either two animals or one animal split in half. These animals represented his helper spirits, which would take him to the other realm where he could communicate with his ancestors. So that's the second theory. The third theory is the theory that Max Luhr, who created those four styles, came up with, and was elaborated by my teacher, his student, Robert Bagley, at Princeton. And this is the theory that they don't mean anything. They have significance, but they don't have meaning. And I'll talk about how can you have significance without having meaning. And what Bagley points out is the nature of the technology, for him, argues against any iconographic identification of this motif as a specific deity. Remember style one. If you go back to style one, we just had a pair of eyes with some swirls around it. it's not really identifiable as a specific motif. It appears mostly decorative. It doesn't look like the later Taotie that we see here. So when people think, oh, this must be a specific deity, they're looking at this. But if you go back to the beginning, this doesn't look anything like that. There's a pair of eyes. And so he argues that the pair of eyes had an apotropaic function. It did sort of ward off evil. It draws your attention. If you put two eyeballs on anything, it makes you look at it. Because the way your brain works, your psychology is, you're drawn to paired eyes. If you had one eye here, it wouldn't have the same power. Put two eyes anywhere, and you're going to look at it. You're going to stare at it. It gives it power and significance. But that doesn't mean this thing with two eyes is a specific named deity that you can pray to. So he points to the Lindisfarne Gospels and the Book of Kells and said, here's the first page of the Gospel of Matthew in the Lindisfarne Gospels. And we look at the first two letters, the Cairo, the beginning of Matthew, and if you zoom in, you see all these elaborate designs, twists and twirls, you see fish, you see birds, you see people, yet it means nothing. It has nothing to do with Jesus, it has nothing to do with Matthew. It's decoration. But the decoration has an impact. The impact is to say, this is important. This is the beginning of the Word of God. And I make it beautiful, and I make it powerful by making it decorative. And so he says we can't get wrapped up in the modern sense of what is decorative. Decorative is something superfluous. It means nothing. Decorative lends impact and importance to religious work, even if the details mean nothing in a specific iconographic sense. And so that's what he argues about these designs, that they have significance and impact, yet they mean nothing in a specific sort of dictionary definition sort of way. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about today is what I did with some of the Santa Barbara bronzes. So a couple months ago, curator Susan Tai let me play with some of the bronzes here in the museum. And I decided I wanted to create some 3D models of these that I could use for teaching and for research. And I experimented with two different ways to make a 3D model. And I'll take you through the process and show you some finished results of one of those today. The first is called structured light scanning. And so you have this special scanner here that has several cameras and several LED lights. And you acquire the surface design of it. We used to use things like lasers for this, but lasers have a lot of problems with shiny objects or transparent objects because the light bounces all over the place. So I used to try to use this with lasers, but that doesn't work as well as one of these structured light scanners. And the other method is called photogrammetry, which uses a standard digital camera and some special software, as well as these little turntables. So let me take you through what I did with one of these bronzes. And later, if you have your phone out, you can actually pull up a model on the web that you can play with of this bronze. So here is a bronze wine vessel, a jue vessel. You can see the wine here would be poured out here. You'd grab it by here, or maybe by these two handles up here, and you'd tip it back. So this is a wine vessel. You can see the Taotie design. There's some other features I'll point out when we have the model up. Using the structured light scanner, you acquire pieces of the vessel. You will scan one side, and what it does, it's triangulating a single point millions of times. So using cameras from different angles, it triangulates and finds the point in space for this point, this point, this point, until there are millions of points of the vessel. And this gives you a sort of a geometry. And more and more of these scans, and here you see after filling in 10 more scans, you have a lot of points approximating the shape of this vessel. And then the computer needs to take over because you need to meld these together into one set of points. And you also need to clean up all the noise. There's lots of noise here, things that don't exist. And holes, tons of holes. Eventually, once you clean this up and weld these together, you get a vessel. And you can still see there's a lot of editing that I had to do here. There's junk down here. But this is a pretty close approximation of that bronze, including the decoration of the eyes and the taotie here on the side. But then you have to do a lot of editing and touch-up and post-processing. So you bring it into a 3D modeling program, the kind you use to make, movie CG stuff, and you have turned it into a wireframe mesh here. And there, I had to fix things. Certain things didn't look right. It didn't quite get the legs right. There's a big chunk missing out of the leg. This is missing a chunk. There were some reflected areas that the light did bounce off of. There were holes that had to be filled in. But eventually, you also get to put the texture on. This is before I fixed the chunk down here. So at the same time, the scanner collects image data, texture data, and once you have the finished vessel, it lays those color points onto the mesh. And then you have this model of the vessel here. And once you have that, okay, so if you want to go to this URL here, you can do it now or later. It's skfb.ly/VJLH. Now, I'll put that back up in a sec because I want to take you to a full-size version of this. So let me take you to that page. All right, so here is the vessel. And so, let me zoom out a little bit here. Yeah, there we go. So there's our vessel. And you can see that it's captured the design. And you can see the pattern. But I can also add annotations here, because underneath here we have an inscription. And so the inscription reads that it's dedicated to his father, the father of the lineage, or the father of his clan. And you can turn the vessel any way you want. You can look on the inside. You can look on the bottom and see the museum tag on the bottom here. And like I said, this works on computers. It works on phones. And so this was made by me over the last couple months using the structured light scanner. And see, you can zoom into quite a level of detail. Don't make you dizzy here. But yeah, we can see nice on the detail there. So the faster the computer you have, the better the detail will come out. Okay. So that's the first method. So that's available up on the web on this site called sketchfab.com, where I put my scanned models. Like Photoshop, and you have to mask out the foreground from the background so that it doesn't take the tripod and other things as part of the model. And so once you do that, you have to align all these different pictures using that triangulation method where the computer program will determine every point from 2 different photographs and find out how deep that point is. And it produces then what's called a sparse cloud of points. You can sort of see this is a cloud that sort of looks like a bronze vessel. You run a very intensive version of the same algorithm over about 4 or 5 hours on the computer that then determines 1,000,000 points. So this is 1,000,000 individual points that it determined the depth of from those digital photos. And a bunch of noise and junk that needs to be cleaned up. And from that, you then create a mesh. It then ties all these together into a mesh. But you can see that there are big problems here that have to be edited. There's a hole here, there's a hole here, and the whole thing is kind of, it looks like oatmeal. It's kind of, the texture is not right. And you notice it doesn't get the Tautier here. You can put the image of the Tautier on it later, but it doesn't get the actual height of the design because it's not using the structured light scanner. It's just using the sort of profiles or the sort of cameo of the different angles. But once you put the image on it, it does look very nice. But if you zoom in, you will not see the same level of texture you saw in the first one that I showed you. And I can show you an example there, this one in progress. I haven't finished completely touching it up yet. So this is the one done by the photogrammetry process, and you can see that I have a lot to fix. There's a hole there. That one's got to be fixed. There's a hole in the bottom down there. Those all have to be touched up manually in a 3D modeling program, like I did with the other one as well. But if we zoom in to the decoration, you do see the decoration, but it's not quite as distinct, and you don't get the raised nature of the eyes. The eyes are not raised. And you can really tell with the little buffalo on the handle. So here on the handle, on the top of the handle, this is supposed to be a buffalo head here. You really can't make it out because it didn't capture that level of detail. But if we look at the other one, done by the other process, here we can see much more clearly. Very clear. So this one is much more faithful to the original, and it allows you to create a model you can use for research and study. The other one is very quick. You don't require the object for as long a period of time. But this particular scanning method, I think, leads to a much more faithful reproduction of the original. And yeah, you can see the eyes are standing out and the flanges stand out much, much better. So I will leave that address up here. Go back. Yeah, so here is the address if you want to check this out at home or on your phone, starting with http skfb.ly/vjlh. And that's what I wanted to talk about today, and I'd be very happy to take your questions for the next half hour or so.